Kara?
We've talked about low-hanging fruit before, like sleep and nutrition, but this study really shows that not getting enough sleep can lead to more risky or impulsive behavior.
So let's think about this. We always need research to sort of, prove things that sometimes our experience or our common sense, our parental common sense tells us. But that as teens, and this is both younger teens and older teens, get less sleep, it affects their judgment and impulse control. Judgment and impulse control are really tied together. So the more you don't get adequate sleep, it affects your judgment and your impulse control. In this particular study, it really looked at the engagement in risky media content. So like R-rated content or violent video games that they weren't supposed to have access to. So it really looked at decision-making and impulsivity.
Yeah, and let's just, for clarity, what amount of sleep should our kids be getting?
The American Academy of Sleep Medicine recommends that children ages 6 to 12 get 9 to 12 hours of sleep. Teens should get about 8 to 10 hours of sleep. So that's a lot of sleep. And we know that babies, young children need a lot of sleep and they need naps. But as children get a little older and, they have other schedules and they have activities and, school, it really impacts sleep. So to really just be mindful as we're entering the summer, kids are out of school, right? I don't necessarily recommend that all structure go out the window. Older kids don't want as much structure, but I can talk about anchor events in the day. But for the most part, we need to prioritize sleep and sleep habits. The other thing I like to remind parents is that sleep is not a light switch. It's not a light switch where you lay down and boop, you fall asleep. It's actually a set of skills to transition from wake to sleep, and engaging in those skills is what gets you better quality sleep.
And I think as adults, we know that we do better with a nighttime routine, and adults aren't always the best about getting the sleep we need either. But how do you sell that to your teen or your kid?
Well, selling it is hard. It's sometimes, and obviously the younger you start, the more you can create habits. And even when you think that you create good habits, as they get to be older teens, and certainly in college, they blow those habits right out of the water with the hope that they'll come back to them again, or come back to those good habits when they're in their, what I'd like to call their right mind, their adult brain. So for the most part, it's just really creating routine. And if you think about it with young children, young children just can't go from doing whatever they're doing in the early evening to putting their pajamas on and going right to bed. You needed to create routines. When my kids were young, it was like bath, bottle, bed.
Yep.
So doing things to create routines, and we'd add another B in there, which was book. So the more you can create routines, even for your young people, to be in their room, settling, and create a better atmosphere for sleep. Not everyone, some kids want it completely dark. Some kids need a little night light. Some kids want a little cup of water by their bed. You don't really want them drinking much water, because then that promotes wakefulness in the evening or in the wee hours. But it's about really creating routines and habits and getting the electronics out of the room, especially for the younger ones.
Yeah. And that's, like you said, it's easier to start. And I think a lot of us understand when the kids are little, and in fact, if you are listening and you've got younger kids, that bath, bottle, bed, that continuing when they're older. We know that our kids, when they're little, have such a better day if they get their naps and if they get their sleep. But what this study is showing is it pretty much is the same thing as they get older, only the stakes might be bigger because the behavior is more impulsive or risky.
The stakes are bigger. And again, we're coming into summer where there's not as much pressure, but this is the time to really work on something. We all need a little downtime first, but to kind of work on establishing some better habits. And so, but the stakes are higher in school when you don't have the ability to pay attention, to concentrate, to tolerate frustration. School's a lot of new and sometimes frustrating experiences. And so it especially in those individuals that have vulnerability. So this study didn't partial out those with like serious attentional disorders or who were neurodivergent in some way, but those individuals with those vulnerabilities have even more difficulties with impulse control and frustration tolerance.
Right, and that means if you're on the spectrum, or even kids with ADHD, the sleep is even more important. I guess it's important for everyone, but what you're saying is more important.
Yes, it's absolutely more important because it comes back to our brains, right? If our brains are rested, and I'm not a sleep medicine expert, but I do so much work with children and adolescents. We talk so much about sleep with parents, but it really is about, being able to hit all the stages of sleep, right? You need deep sleep, you need light sleep, you need REM sleep. You don't want a lot of periods of wakefulness where you're getting out of bed. So the more you can create quality sleep and that's restful, the more it just affects your mood and your energy as well.
Yeah, and it's important to note that tweens and teens are already predisposed to impulsivity because of the development in their brain. I just went to our son's 8th grade graduation. The principal mentioned that developmentally, the brain doesn't go through a bigger growth spurt than from those ages of like 0 to 5 and then now, like in these teen years and those middle school years. So I don't know if that lines up in the psychological literature, but there's a lot happening for these kids.
Absolutely. And really, I think having been through a few middle school graduations or promotion ceremonies, it's fascinating to see, the eighth graders, some are this tall, some are this tall, right? And that the range in their physical development and the range in their social emotional development is vast. And some of that is just like biological or genetic or part of their temperament in terms of some of their social emotional growth. Some of it's in the context or in the environment that they're in, because that does have an impact. So the more we can address factors that we have some little modicum of control over, which one of those is sleep. Some things we don't have control over. If people are, if you're not really happy with your school district, that's a huge step to like move out of your district.
Right.
But the things that we do have control over, it's important to exert that control.
So control is a tricky word, right? Because parents will say, oh my gosh, I don't have control. My kid is screaming at me and not wanting to go to bed, saying none of their parents, none of the other kids have to go to bed right now, or why are you taking my phone, or the battles that I think sometimes parents will, all right, it's summer, I'm just going to let them. So what does the conversation look like? And I know you're usually reasonable. So let's say we're talking about tweens and maybe younger teens. Let's start there. What does that conversation look like? What is a good schedule for the summer?
I do think that there needs to be a little sort of like let loose time, right? School's just ending in a lot of in most all districts. And you need to have a little bit of like, let me just feel my oats a little bit. I'm not necessarily one, I appreciate that you call me reasonable because I don't know that my kids would call me that, but I'm not one to like launch into a highly structured schedule. I do think that young people need a little bit of emotional space to just sort of let loose. But it's all about the communication. Listen, school's just getting out. I'm going to give you a week or so to just kind of collect yourself. But starting the following week, we're going to have a little bit of not a lot, but a little bit of a routine and schedule where you go to bed around a certain time, you get up around a certain time, and that you have an anchor event, you have something to do in the morning, something to do in the afternoon. That middle school age, that 12 to like 14 is really hard in terms of like summer programming because they've aged out of some, younger summer camps or summer programs. Some kids can be left home alone, but they're not necessarily wanting to be in a highly structured environment. So that middle school age is, I think, particularly difficult when it comes to programming, but it is really about the communication. So it's saying, listen, I'm going to give you a little downtime. I understand that. I understand that you need a break, but then we're going to have somewhat of a routine and a schedule. and so that you're not totally out of whack, because, you know, reeling someone in mid-August is going to be really painful if they've been staying up all night and sleeping all day.
Do you recommend some sort of a summer contract? I know I've tried that before. Some parents will write it down so you just don't have to be arguing about it every day. Like, let's agree.
Yeah, I mean, you can do a contract. I think it's, and that also is based on age. But it's really, it's communicating what your intent is and what your expectations are. And parents need to repeat themselves constantly, right? It's not ever a one and done. It's not like, yep, I said that last week, I don't need to say it again. No, you might need to be saying it every day, sometimes multiple times a day. So
Right.
having reasonable expectations, communicating what you expect, what the guidelines are, and then continually reinforcing it. I mean, sometimes you do have to get into consequences. We know that the greatest way to change behavior is through positive reinforcement, not through throwing a lot of consequences at someone. So the more we can positively reinforce behavior, give attention when there is positive and pro-social behavior, that's really much more effective.
Right, and I know there's a lot of research on that. One of the godfathers of it would be the Kasden method, which was, I know, lots of books written about that. People can get the Kasden method. It was done at Yale. I know that psychologists always say that. Hard as a parent, because I think we all grew up with, like, of course they had bad behavior, we need to scold you. So what does that look like? Let's say, you know, you're struggling. Your kids, you want them to start going to bed a little bit earlier and not having a fit about taking the devices or shutting them down through screen time, because you know that they need a good night's sleep. And yet there's like this battle going on of that spectrum of freedom and responsibility. So how do what would it look like to positively reinforce when they're going, well, there's nothing to reinforce. I'm just scolding them and stealing the iPad because they were just rude and wouldn't give it back.
Right. So finding ways to reinforce the behaviors that you want. So if you want your child to get to bed at a certain time, and then allow them, you know, their solid sleep time, whatever it is, you know, 8, 9, 10 hours, allow them their solid sleep time. In the morning, you might allow a little extra, you know, whatever their reinforcer is. Is it screen time? Is it, you know, I'd love it for it to be just going outside. But when they can follow that routine in the morning, because they can't get the reward before they engage in the behavior, in the morning, they get a little extra screen time, or that day they get a little extra screen time, however you structure it. So you're rewarding the behaviors that you want to focus on. The other thing to remember is that you can't target 5 different behaviors at a time. You pick 1 or 2 behaviors that you focus on, you set some goals, you engage in conversation. What would you want to earn as part of doing A and B? So you're engaging their cooperation. And then really trying to move forward. And you will see as a parent, okay, that seemed to work, or no, that was a disaster, that didn't work at all. But just because sometimes something is a disaster and doesn't work at first, doesn't mean it's not a good idea. Sometimes you just need to persist with it.
Okay, so you say, hey, we're going to do this for a week, and you know, every day that you're up by 10 a.m. and doing what I want you to do, having breakfast and whatever, then you can go on your screen, or you get to go take your bike wherever
the
you want to
reinforcer
go,
would be.
Maybe you get to go ride your bike to Dunkin' Donuts. I know food is a big deal for some kids.
And I love that, because now they're outside and they're exercising.
Right. I know I get annoyed about them buying junk food, but I guess we got to pick our battles. And so that's important too. I mean, back to the point of what we were talking about, this study really shows that we all want cooperation and good relationships with our kids. But the basic of just, if they're not well rested, that is going to be much, much harder. We know that, but this study proves it.
Yes, and again, it affects the decision making, right? Decision making is about judgment, it's about impulse control, it's about problem solving, right? All of these skills, they're more kind of soft skills. All these skills are things that work better. Literally, the neural connections in your brain, it works better when you get adequate sleep and adequate nutrition.
And, we can get crazy with that, right? As parents, we're like, oh my gosh, they have to have all these vegetables and they're not allowed to ever have sugar. And there's a lot on Instagram, and there's parents who look like everything's perfect. I know this is a good message to say that sometimes progress, not perfection. If your kid right now is only sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night, you're not going to go to 10 hours tomorrow. There might be a spectrum of getting there. Is that right?
Yes. And looking at things in terms of small victories, not large victories, because it's easier to create a feeling of, okay, this is at least moving in a positive direction. So if you can get them to bed around a certain time, the hope would be that, naturally their body will just keep them in, bed a little longer. Their body will need some rest. Again, especially for younger kids, keeping them more active during the day helps burn energy, because if you have excess energy, it's really hard to sleep. Some kids need a little snack a little bit before bedtime, not right as they're going to bed. But especially kids with fast metabolism, they need to eat intermittently throughout the day. So creating habits and patterns that will be successful, but parents know their kids. Parents know usually what will motivate them, what will be helpful and supportive to them, and how to try to move them in a direction. But we want to focus on small successes as opposed to the larger goals.
Right, and I love going back to what you said about positive reinforcement. That, again, it's sometimes counterintuitive, because we immediately think of the consequence for maybe being rude or not doing the homework or breaking the rules. Well, if you don't do this, then I'm going to do this. But really what you're asking us to think about is almost ignore, maybe not unsafe or horrible behavior, but ignore some of the negative stuff and look for the wins.
Yes. And, I have parents ask me all the time about, should I really be focusing on that? I'm like, well, let's try to shift our focus a little bit here. Let's try to, and again, pick a couple of positive pro-social behaviors that you want to focus on. Sometimes it's okay to ignore those little things that your child does that are kind of rude or annoying. I mean, safety issues we're not ignoring, and anything that's a safety issue we have to address. But you can't spend your days, just stop doing this, don't do that, sit up straight, eat this, don't do. I mean, that kind of negative criticism all day long really wears on kids. And also what it causes them to do is tune you out. So now they don't even know what you've said anymore.
And with not having the school structure, as much as kids are excited to be outside of school, they can get really maybe a little anxious when they don't know what to do with themselves, and they're bored, and they can go from so much structure, school, sports, to okay, it's summer, what do I do with myself? And this is really hard, I know, especially for parents who work outside the home.
Yes, and that's why for kids that can be home alone, I talk about it as an anchor event. I don't, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but your task for today is to do A in the morning and B in the afternoon, and then I'll be home around dinner time or whatever. So it's just to have an anchor event, something to do, one or two things to do in each day. I mean, it could be, on Wednesdays, you walk to the library and you take out a new book, or, you can even meet your friend at the library. So having something to do, very often parents need to sort of set that up, because kids might think of it themselves, but they might not think of something that that you feel is even somewhat productive. So having some kind of an anchor event in each day, 1 to 2 things that your child needs to do, it helps sort of structure their day in even a loose way during the summer.
I can hear the teens yelling already. I want to sleep in and I want to stay up late. What's a good rule of thumb for those teens?
Right. So there is, yeah, we can loosen things up a little bit. We don't need you to be in bed by 9 o'clock and up at 6 o'clock. But and again, it's very dependent on the age of the child and what that child's sleep needs are. Right. I know young people that need to sleep 12 hours a day. So guess what? They need to be in bed in order to function. But I worry with the young people that tick the clock. They're going to bed at 11. Now they're going to bed at midnight. Now they're going to bed at 1. Now they're going to bed at 2. Then they move themselves up into that awake for a good part of the night and then sleeping a good part of the day. It really wrecks your internal biorhythm system, because naturally we are diurnal creatures. We need to be awake during the light, and it's beautiful outside, and it gets light around between 6 and 7. So allowing light into their bedrooms around that time, and if that means a parent sort of opens curtains and shades to let the light in to sort of help naturally rouse them. So to really focus on what works best for your body. And sometimes it's having frank conversations like, listen, you're an irritable mess when you stay up late. You really are.
Yeah.
So let's focus more on getting to bed by 11, or, you know, finding a time that's reasonable based on age, getting to bed at a certain time, creating some routines. The earlier you start, the better it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe if you've got those older teens, they're going to push to midnight. But like even then, I think you said before that hopefully before midnight. Just as human beings, my dad used to say nothing good happens after midnight. I guess with staying awake, unless it's a special event like a wedding or something, it's probably a good rule of thumb.
Yeah, I say the same. Nothing good happens after midnight. So let's, you know, but it's the wind down. So it's not just like running, you know, being out with your friends, running in the door at 11:59 and then expecting to be asleep by midnight. That's not going to happen. There needs to be that wind down time. And yes, these teens, especially these older teens, are so resistant to any kind of parental intervention. I'm dealing with it as well. But the more we can just keep hammering home about how this ultimately benefits you.
Yeah.
Right. I have decent sleep habits. I don't always sleep well, but I have decent sleep habits. And the more we can create good sleep habits, it just makes you feel better during the day.
I know that you are not a psychiatrist and not a physician. You're a psychologist, but this comes up in our Channel 3 Mom Squad a lot. I know a lot of other moms talk about, hey, my kid has trouble sleeping, especially those kids maybe who take medication. If you have ADHD and you're taking Adderall, it can be hard to wind down. And some of them are going to take it through the summer because it might help them with behavior. There's a lot of talk about, is it okay to give my kids melatonin? Is it okay to, you know, do something like there's a lot of sleep products on the market? Any comments on that?
Yes, so I'm not a physician, but melatonin is an over-the-counter supplement. And if you read the directions on the back, I mean, basically it says to start with the lowest dose, which I think is like either 1 or 3 milligrams, to get a brand that is pretty well known, because sometimes they, you know, the compounds are different. To really understand what melatonin does, though, melatonin helps with the onset of sleep. Mm-hmm. But again, it has to be combined with good habits, right? If you're, you know, if you're actively doing something and taking melatonin, you can push through it and it's not going to help you fall asleep. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't help with staying asleep. It helps with falling asleep. And so it can help you with creating routines. Melatonin is something that's naturally occurring in the body. So taking melatonin over the counter and, you know, helping yourself create some sleep habits, it will help you fall asleep. But remember, it doesn't help you necessarily stay asleep.
Right. And I'll just share that I've done, you can look back at other CURES podcasts, and we've done them on melatonin. And most of the naturopathic doctors who are, that's what they've gone to med school for 5 years, will say melatonin is safe. But again, start at that lowest dose, get a very pure brand that doesn't have a lot of fillers and bad things in it. And of course, you want to talk to your pediatrician. But I have had my own experience where some certain nights, the kids, in our house, we don't do it every night, but there have been nights where like, they're just, I can't fall asleep. And I'm like, okay, it's okay. Here's a melatonin gummy. And, yeah. And it seems to help. So I'm throwing that out there as a mom, not as a physician either, but I have interviewed some very skilled people in this. So I'll, of course, always talk to your own doctor. But in closing, this is a study that has been done by you know, with peer-reviewed, clinical, the whole bit. Important to know if we want to have that conversation with our kids. Just like we did episodes on social media affecting their mental health, we now know that not sleeping enough affects their mental health because it's predisposing them to more risky, impulsive behavior.
Absolutely.
Well, we appreciate your time, and good luck to all the parents. I know you have college kids out there. I'll just, in closing, in our final 3 minutes together, you being a child psychologist and 2 kids in college home, any advice for those who have those older kids who think they don't need rules?
This is a wild ride because they think they don't need rules. They have their own schedules when they are when they're at college, and so dialing them back in to recreate some habits is very, very challenging. But the important part as a parent is persistence, staying with it, reinforcing what you believe is best for your child, your teen, your college age child, reinforcing as much as possible. They may not listen, but I still want, my voice in their head saying, this is what's the right thing to do. This is how, you function best. Whether or not they take that is an ongoing struggle.
Yeah. And we all know as adults, sometimes those voices, they kick in a little later. We might not even admit that they're kicking in, but you remember what your mother said.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So back to I like to leave people as they're summing up. So we know sleep's important, trying to go before midnight, and we're talking about those younger kids might need up to 12 hours of sleep. And then those older teens, we're still talking like 8 to 10.
Yeah, and again, your child, that your child, actually, they do okay with 8 hours, or goodness gracious, your child absolutely needs closer to 9 or 10 hours for them to function adequately during the day. So it's trying to maximize their ability to function, but knowing what works best and really trying your best to make that happen.
Dr. Saunders, we appreciate your time. I want to let everyone know you're with the Institute of Living, which is a premier mental health facility right in Hartford. So lots of resources out there for parents to use. We want to wish everyone luck. I know you always say parenting is the hardest job on earth.
It is the hardest job.
And we don't get paid for it. No, I'm just kidding.
No.
All right, so we wish everyone a good luck for the summer. I hope you can listen to this with your spouse, with your partner. Thank you for motivating us to stay persistent. And, maybe you need to get some of those melatonin gummies if you can. So we appreciate you being here, Dr. Laura Saunders.
Take care, Kara.
And you can follow me on all social media at Kara Sundlin. I would love it if you joined the CURES Cures Facebook group. Just search CURES Cures. We share cutting-edge wellness information on all of those places. Have a great day, everyone, and be well.